Hi, everyone. It's Dr. Shafer. As a trigger warning, today's episode will be discussing femicide, homicide, and domestic violence and abuse. I'd like to have a moment of silence for victims of domestic violence and femicide. Thank you to all of the professionals, including our guest, Clare Laxton, who are doing the important work of highlighting the stories of victims of femicide and domestic violence, and working to improve the lives of victims. Our hearts go out to the families and friends of victims of violence. If you're a victim and at risk in an emergency, make sure you call 911 or your country's emergency service and access resources such as your National Domestic Violence Line. You matter so much, and I'm so glad you're here.
All of these are coercive and controlling behaviours that make up a pattern of very dangerous abuse. And in its most extreme form, what I talk about on Killer in the Family podcast is where men kill their whole families. And not always, but very often, that is a controlling and coercive perpetrator whose partner has left him and, sort of broken that link with the control. And that is the most dangerous time for women and children.
Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Dr. Shafer of Talks with Dr. Shafer. I'm so glad you're here. I'm a physician, mom, life coach, musician, author, publisher, and I am passionate about helping others reclaim their stories so you can build your most beautiful future. And health and wellness aren't possible when we are fearful. And unfortunately, that is an experience for many women and men across the globe. I am honored to have Clare Laxton on the show today. Clare Laxton has 15 years of experience leading charity sector campaigns and communications, has her master's in criminal justice, and is the host and creator of a true crime podcast called Killer in the Family. And she is advocating for justice for victims and prevention of femicide and domestic violence. Clare, thank you so much for being here on Talks with Dr. Shafer.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here and to be discussing this really important topic.
It is incredibly important to discuss, and I think to acknowledge that it's also very difficult to talk about for a variety of reasons. But you were inspired to take this difficult and important topic head on to create your true crime podcast. Now, that aired first in 2023, I understand. What inspired you to take on this particular topic and create such an amazing podcast to share with the world?
So in my professional experience working predominantly in the UK charity sector, I've worked mostly with women survivors of domestic abuse and trauma. So I've worked in national domestic abuse charities and charities that support women that have experienced complex trauma, including domestic abuse and other issues as well. And through that work, I recognise and I see their experiences that are not just physical domestic abuse, which they have experienced, but also what we now call in England and Wales coercive and controlling behaviour. And through my work, I was part of a campaign to criminalise coercive and controlling behaviour. So it has been a crime in England and Wales for 10 years. So since 2015, and other countries have followed suit, including some states in Australia, France, Scotland, Ireland, and Canada. So there's a real increasing recognition of the real insidious dangers of what we call coercive control. And I recognize through my work and through my research that I was doing, which I'm sure we will talk about later, that actually that is often not recognized, particularly in the sort of podcast and media space. You often hear the phrase, oh, they were in a toxic relationship. Well, actually,
Mm.
very often that is an abusive relationship of mostly a man of a woman, and that toxicity that people talk about is coercive and controlling behaviors like deliberate isolation from families and friends, belittling of what someone looks like, controlling what they wear, what makeup they wear, what they can look like, controlling what their hair looks like. You know, I've seen perpetrators force someone to have a shared Facebook account or, you know, shared social media. So they're constantly seeing who people are talking to and what they're doing. They install spyware and other things on their computers and phones so they can monitor their activity as well. And things like economic abuse. So they might have a joint account that they give someone, you know, a stipend or allowance that they have to earn. All of these are coercive and controlling behaviors that make up a pattern of very dangerous abuse. And in its most extreme form, what I talk about on Killer in the Family podcast is where men kill their whole families. And not always, but very often that is a controlling and coercive perpetrator whose partner has left him and, you know, sort of broken that link with the control. And that is the most dangerous time for women and children. And the media response to Femicide, for example, is very excusing the perpetrator and blaming the victim. Like, he was a great dad, he was a loving husband, but he wasn't, because he just killed his children and partner. So I really want to challenge some of those, you know, those narratives that we see, but also really raise awareness, particularly of coercive control and its dangers.
It is such important work, and I applaud you and want to express my gratitude to you for the work you did in 2015. I'm based in the United States, and it's intriguing for me because as someone who talks to guests from all around the world, women from all around the world, victims from all around the world, it's interesting how the societal fabric and pressures and what's normalized in your community and your country and your region of the world affects the laws and therefore what is acceptable behavior. And when you were discussing how this is illegal, coercive control is illegal, that allows us to lean into actions that help with prevention of this global problem of femicide. Because as you noted, the seeds are often, or one could say most always, born out of coercive control patterns of behavior. But often what happens, the experience of victims that did manage to get out alive but not unscathed here in the United States with our legal system, is when they went to the police, when they went to file a restraining order, when they went to court, because a crime has been committed against them. There are, as you noted, even after someone has been murdered, there are excuses made for behaviors that are clearly a seed of the problem and a warning sign. So how can we, with the research that you have done and the experience you have with analyzing these crimes, how can we start to take the clock back so that we aren't investigating the murders of women, which is tragic, but also has been pointed out in other documentaries and studies to be at a very high cost to society, due to not only the loss of that life, but also the cost of litigation, etc. So how can we turn back the clock and start to prevent these horrific events from happening by holding people accountable to that behavior in real time when it's happening and we see the risks before our eyes?
I think that is such an important and valuable question. And I think there are two things. So, as you said in the introduction, so I've just completed my master's in criminal justice, and I'm about to start a doctorate in criminal justice as well, continue to explore the links between intimate partner homicide and coercive control. And my master's dissertation looked specifically at what that meant for the policing of domestic abuse. And my doctorate thesis is looking at what that means for other statutory agencies. So what I found I think the first thing is that the policing response to domestic abuse can definitely be improved. And I think what I found in my research, so part of my research was analysing 135, and in England and Wales, we call them domestic homicide reviews. So they are reviews that have taken place, so they're statutory, after someone is killed in a domestic situation, basically. So I looked at 135 domestic homicide reviews that were a woman that had been killed by a male intimate partner or former intimate partner since 2015. And through looking at those, I found that coercive control was a risk factor in nearly 3/4, so 73%. So a huge risk factor for homicide. It wasn't the only risk factor, though. Other issues such as separation, as we talked about, economic abuse, and physical violence were other very prevalent risk factors in those homicides. And I think what one of the most important findings there, in less than half of the cases, so in 43% of domestic homicide reviews that I analysed, police were engaged with the couple as a couple and aware of the potential violence and abuse that was going on between them. But that meant that there was more than half of those women who were killed by either a current or former intimate partner had no engagement with the police. So the first engagement the police had was after they had been killed. And for me, that really flips a lot of the script that we have on its head, because so much of our response to domestic abuse is through a criminal justice lens. And that's not wrong. There is absolutely a role that the police and criminal justice can play. And I'll talk about what I think, some of those improvements could be. But for me, those women and perpetrators were engaged with other statutory agencies. Maybe it was a doctor, maybe it was, emergency services, maybe it was midwives, maybe it was a mental health service, or social services. A lot of them were engaged in like children's social care, like social services. So those other statutory agencies, for me, that's what I want to explore with my thesis and doctorate, is how much knowledge do they have of coercive control? How much space do they have to act on, any fears that they have for those people? How well does that information sharing work between professionals? And, so thinking about not just the police, but those other statutory agencies. And I think that's so important. And so that's the first thing, looking at other statutory agencies that have a role in people's lives, people's everyday lives. They will go to their general practitioner, they'll go to their doctor, they might be engaged in social services or social care. They all have a role in people's lives, and they have a role in understanding what coercive control is and the dangers that it poses. But when we do look at the police, when I looked at those cases that did have police engagement, I did see that the vast majority of the victims of homicides that I was, exploring, had had a risk assessment from the police. So that's good. They had a risk assessment. But only 25% of them had been assessed as high risk. And to me, that seems to be a failure, because all of those women ended up dying, but only 25% of them is seen as high risk. And other research, other published research, particularly around police forces in England and Wales have still shown a real priority over physical violence when police are risk assessing victim survivors. So coercive control and some of those behaviours we've talked about are on the risk assessment form. But when the officer is going through how to assess that risk, it's the incident of physical violence or sexual violence that takes priority. And that's a real issue, because if those victim survivors aren't classed as high risk, then they don't get referred into other support and, onwards. And one case that I looked at, which really stays with me, the victim survivor had 25 risk assessments. And for me, that is, there's a question over that process, because she had 25 risk assessments, all which came out at different, levels, and yet she was still murdered. So where's the professional curiosity there about why she's had so many risk assessments and why nothing has changed? So I think there's two things there that are really important in terms of the police response to domestic abuse, but also other statutory agencies' response to domestic abuse that can be addressed here.
Two questions that come to my mind, or statements that often are asked of women who do survive, who leave, who are trying to share their stories, often for the first time, very carefully, because many of us have been trained not to share our stories. Two questions that they're often asked that can be very traumatizing and re-victimizing are, why didn't you leave sooner? And why didn't you go to the police? If it was that bad, why didn't you tell anyone? And both of those echo in my mind when you are discussing the research that you've done and the research that you will be doing, because we know why. We know why women don't. It doesn't mean that they shouldn't, but we know why those choices are made, because as you demonstrated, the highest risk time is often when you're leaving. So when we ask, why don't you leave? Well, because women understand that. And that leads me to something that we were discussing off camera before coming on about, why do women enjoy, or why are women the highest group of people, the statistically highest number of people listening to true crime podcasts? Some people may say, well, why are women enjoying listening about crime? Well, I don't think that that's the reason that they are the highest statistical group of people who listen to true crime. I think it's because of what you've discussed so far, and these questions that we're asked. Why didn't you leave? Why didn't you go to the police? It's because as women, we are living in a world where we want to arm ourselves with information about what went wrong for other women, because we know that we're walking around at a higher risk and we want to prepare ourselves.
Absolutely. And I think you're completely correct in that is why the majority of true crime listeners are women, because we have to constantly risk assess, not only when we are out in the public, just walking along, running, walking home, whatever we're doing, we're still constantly risk assessing. But actually, because the most dangerous place for women is in the home, then we are constantly risk assessing there as well. And I think so many people have, when they've sort of fed back to me about my podcast, or I've talked to them about my work, is like, oh, I've learned so much. I understand and I recognize. And actually, lots of women have said, I was in a coercively controlling relationship and I just didn't know I didn't know what to call it. But now now I've heard you talk about it, I absolutely understand that that's what it was. And I think we listen to true crime, I think not only to prepare for the risks that we might face, but I think some other people I've spoken to, some of my listeners, it's to try and understand. So like
Mm.
really understand someone's, I guess, motivation in a way for why they might commit a horrible crime, and to start understanding some of that, what's going on through their mind. How can we anticipate that? How can we keep ourselves safe? What are the red flags? I think particularly with coercive control, what are those red flags that we should be looking for? Because I think something else that came out in my research, and all of the work I've done with survivors, is nobody knows what to call that sort of behavior. So
Mm.
often friends and family know that there's something wrong. They know that I don't like it how he really belittled her in public and how he tells her what to wear. They know that something's not right, but they don't necessarily know what the name is for that behavior. They don't know that it's illegal, and then they don't know how dangerous it is. So I think there is a huge element of like awareness raising as well, which is happening all the time since coercive control has been made illegal. But I think it's such an important aspect of, supporting victim survivors of domestic abuse and coercive control. It is raising that awareness and knowing what those red flags are. But I think you're right. The bottom line for a lot of women who listen to true crime is to be prepared, to know what risks we're up against.
It's fascinating to me because I was thinking when you were talking about how the feedback that you get from listeners and how they are listening to better understand. And it makes me think back to the time in my life when I was in an abusive relationship, and I was what is used oftentimes in psychological discussions about narcissistic relationships and, as you mentioned, toxic relationships. I was very trauma bonded to this person. So instead of focusing on the simple realities of the situation, which would boil down to what you're discussing, which is coercive control, right? Instead of focusing on every behavior and thinking, well, why did that happen? What was the wound that caused this behavior? What can we do to fix it? Right? When you've had the conversations, you've made clear that this isn't acceptable and it's still happening. And as a sidebar, if you're not being treated humanely or with respect, it's important to understand that, most people understand that they're doing that. Right. They understand if they're able to go out of the home and behave with respect and maintain their social status and their relationships there with ease, and they're coming home and they're being abusive to their partner. That's a choice. That's not a wound that needs to be fixed. That's your responsibility. That's a decision that they're making. And it's a part of this coerce control and this abusive environment and dynamic that you are a part of. And it's not your responsibility to fix them. Your only responsibility is to make choices for your safety and to make choices in the timing that works for you, because it's important to say that that's not to shame anyone for the choices that they made and the timeline that they've gone on in their journey if they are coping with coercive control, domestic abuse, domestic violence. We all have choices to make, and we have to educate ourselves and make them the best that we can. And shaming ourselves is so unhelpful in that journey as we are trying to make those safe choices. And that's why I love how you present this information that often women, also men, but women are craving to have about what's happening in these relationships. What was going on behind the scenes that led to this, but you're also boiling it down to the simple truths of the matter, the risk factors that most often come down to this abusive, coercive, controlling behavior. Because if we can focus on that, I believe that's when we can help women see those warning signs and help men see those warning signs so that they make different choices instead of expending their time and energy trying to fix this other person.
Absolutely. And I think one thing that I really want people to understand more about coercive control is how much it limits someone's ability to make choices, to make decisions. So there's a professor called Liz Kelly who talks about space for action and how, you know, a coercive controlling perpetrator reduces someone's space for action because they're constantly probably second guessing their decisions. They're second guessing everything because that is how the abuse and the control has been created in their mind. And so actually, you know, Evan Stark talks about it as a deprivation of liberty and choice. And I think that's such a great example of how to conceive it in someone's mind. It's so challenging if you haven't been through it, that actually, yes, you might be making everyday decisions, but your sphere of influence over your own life is so small because of the coercive control that you're experiencing, that actually I would argue that very often they're not informed choices. They are choices based on what will not have a negative consequence. You know, what will not upset my partner? What will not, you know, make him want to hit me? Those sorts of things. And that's not, and I think it's so difficult to conceive that, isn't it? But actually, that is so often why women do not leave, because their whole capacity for making choices and decisions has been completely eroded and destroyed. Notwithstanding, you know, things like economic abuse and threats to children and threats of suicide, which are all other absolute valid reasons why someone doesn't leave an abusive relationship. But I think that I think we still don't really understand that real insidious nature of coercive control and the damage that it does. And I remember when we were, you know, campaigning to have it made a criminal offence, I did like a radio interview and the presenter was just like, oh, so you're just making nagging illegal. And I was like, no, that's not what this is about at all. You know, this is about the intention behind those abusive patterns of behaviours that are intended to instill fear and intended to make someone do like whatever you want. And I think that element and that sort of understanding of coercive control isn't there yet with lots of professionals. And I think that's why you know, the police and other agencies really focus on that leaving. So once someone has left, they're like, job done, double tick, the end. Whereas actually, as we know, it's not job done. That's when you should be putting in additional protections, like additional safeguarding measures, particularly for women and children, and particularly if there's any sort of child contact going on. That is the most dangerous time. It's not job done. It is not, you know, tick, we've got her to leave the relationship. And I think that that level of understanding definitely still needs to be sort of more developed and more investigated as well.
So for people who maybe have had the hair raise on the back of their neck in a conversation that they witnessed with their friend and their partner, they thought, or, you know, their nervous system was a bit triggered. That felt funny, but then I just kind of changed the discussion because it was awkward and maybe he drank too much at this dinner or whatever. Or the person who is feeling something's off at home in their own life, or maybe they're seeing something in their parents' life, because we know elder abuse, something we've talked about recently on the show, is also very common. And femicide occurs in later years of life as well. Often when we have these discussions, we're thinking about people of a certain age group, but it does happen across the lifespan. So what are some red flags or warning signs of a coercive, controlling relationship that we may witness in daily life that should raise our awareness and let us know, hey, I need to be cognizant. I need to if I feel it's appropriate to do so, to make sure that I'm presenting myself as a safe space for this person if they need help.
I think that's such an important question, because I'm sure we have all been in those situations at one point or another. And I think some common ones are, if you are out with your friend and they maybe get, lots and lots of repeated text messages on their phone, asking them where they are, telling them to call them, calling them names, swearing at them constantly. To me, that's a red flag. And I think this is, with all of these, it's repeated patterns of behavior. So if you see that all the time, that to me is a repeated pattern of behavior. I think controlling what someone wears, controlling who they see, controlling where they go. I had one particularly extreme example that a victim survivor told me, was that when she was at work, she had to have her partner on like an earbud for the whole day, like on the phone, just in her ear, for the whole day, so he could know what she was doing, know what was happening, know what was going on in meetings, and all of that, all of those things. So I think those sorts of things, it sounds extreme, but you might not notice it until you really start thinking about it. I think any sort of fear that you see in, if you don't do something. So, someone might be, oh, I'm half an hour late. Got to get home. I can't, I can't be late. That sort of, that real, it's the reaction that you might see that's like a real high increase in stress and fear. And it's the repeated nature of that. So if you're seeing that constantly. And I think one of the challenging things about coercive control is that it usually starts with love bombing, right? So someone is so charming, so like enthusiastic, really gets someone into a relationship very quickly and gets them dependent on them very quickly. And part of that is getting them away from their friends and family and their support network. That's why it's really, I have lots of conversations with people of like, I don't know what to do because she won't return my texts or calls, or I can't go and see her, or, that sort of thing. And it's how you remain to display yourself, as you put it, as a safe space, and that you believe them and that you want to help them, but that you're not telling them what to do. It's so challenging, and it's really, it's a difficult thing. But I think, Women's Aid, for example, has lots of great advice on its website. I'm sure there will be local services for people that also has advice around signs to look out for, some, things around safety planning. They definitely have stuff around what to do if you suspect someone is experiencing coercive control and domestic abuse. So I think arm yourself with information as well before, maybe stepping into a potentially dangerous situation.
Yes, absolutely. And understanding that intervention can also be triggering and can influence the situation as well. So just being very cognizant of that. This is a really common problem. I wanted to discuss some statistics that we have. So looking at UN Women's website in 2023, over 51,000 women and girls worldwide were killed by their intimate partners or other family members, including fathers, mothers, uncles, and brothers. And translating that, on average, 140 women or girls are killed every day by someone in their family, or someone every 10 minutes. A woman or girl is killed by someone in their own family. And so this is a common issue. This is not as rare as we would like to think. And again, as we started the show, sometimes we want to look away from these difficult circumstances. But the reality is, when we see these stories on the news, we often say, oh my gosh, I can't believe this happened to this beautiful woman. We see her picture, we hear about family that's left behind, or we hear tragically about children that were also killed, murdered by other family members in a multiple murder and potentially suicide situation. And we think, gosh, what could we have done to impact change when we could, right? Where did we miss our opportunities? And so it's really important that we learn how to walk beside people who are suffering from domestic abuse and domestic violence, because that's the time. And I think we're so trained to look away and to mind our own business, but that's the time, that's the opportunity that we have. And that may be for providing support for people in our personal lives, but it also can be our professional lives. I want to go back to something that you mentioned earlier about the research that you're doing now about trying to understand, when are our professionals having these conversations, and what comes of these conversations, right? Because there's a barrier to having the conversation. We know that someone who comes in who maybe says no to a domestic violence screener question, who comes to see someone like myself, a doctor, or their nurse practitioner in hospital or in clinic, that doesn't mean that it's not happening. They may not feel safe or ready to report. Now, with the way that we have our electronic filings of every visit note, a lot of that information is going to go straight onto someone's chart. And as you mentioned, people aren't just necessarily listening through your devices. They also may be monitoring your email. They may be monitoring your medical chart, because that could potentially be a high risk situation for them. And identifying that as a red flag, not as we share this account because we're so close and we don't keep secrets. We don't have to share accounts to have that sort of relationship. We can just simply not keep secrets if that's a choice that we decide as a couple, that we won't keep secrets. Okay. But we don't have to have passwords and access to medical charts, because at the end of the day, if something goes wrong and women or men report this on their chart and it's red, that could potentially put them in danger. And these are the kind of calculations, as you said, when someone's choosing to leave the situation, that they're thinking about. And they're trying to weigh risk versus benefit and choose the best way forward in that moment. And today that might look different from what a week from now looks like, and navigating that so that they don't end up a victim, a statistic of femicide, because of the way that the timing was with this coercive, controlling individual, or this individual who then went on to take their lives. Do you have, I know you're early on in your study of this with your doctoral work, do you have a framework to help people in policing, in the medical field, who are having concerns or being told by victims that they have safety issues at home, or they have coercive control issues at home that are putting them at risk? How do they go about actionable methods to turn that into improving that person's safety?
And I think that is the ultimate question, isn't it? And I think so many topics and issues that we talk about that are really challenging for lots of professionals. There is guidance, there is information, their professional bodies will have guidance on coercive control, what to look out for. If you're going into someone's home, for example, if you're a social worker, or if someone's coming to your surgery, for example, if you're a doctor, there is that headline professional guidance. I think what I'm really interested in is how that is being translated on the front line, and if people have confidence to talk it through as a professional. So there was a news story recently here that social workers in England and Wales weren't being trained in coercive control. They have guidance on it. There's statutory guidance on the actual piece of legislation, but without the training, how would any professional feel confident in dealing with a disclosure or understanding what, it's very rare that somebody would say to a professional, I am experiencing coercive and controlling behavior. They are not going to say that. They are going to say, for example, oh, my partner, oh no, he won't let me do that. Like, this is how it is here. I have to do this. One of the one of the cases that I analysed, the perpetrator exerted his control by only having one key to the house and to the woman having that key. So she always had to be at home if she was going to be at home. And then he bought lots of pets. So then she had to look after the pets and be at home. You know, there's so many insidious different tactics that perpetrators use. I think it's how you give people the knowledge and the confidence to be able to recognize that and not immediately sort of go through like, right, you know, let's highlight this immediately, but understand what that means and what that could feel like for someone and what the options are in terms of both risk assessing and safeguarding what, you know, that person. And I think particularly for social workers, for example, they will likely be focusing on the children's safety. And coercive control and domestic abuse, as we know, is extraordinarily damaging for children and the trauma that they experience through it. So even looking at it through that lens, I think you need to give someone the confidence to know what to look for and how to have that sort of professional response to it. So I think I don't know the answer to that question at the moment, but it's one that I'm definitely looking for.
Absolutely. It's an answer I think we're all as physicians always looking for as well, because especially where we are in medicine, when it comes to anything in medicine, we're very much in a time of no longer practicing what was practiced 30, 40 years ago, which we term paternalistic medicine, right? Where you come to me and I say, well, this is your problem and this is what you should do. And if you don't do that, you are a term we use called non-compliant, right? So almost like a slap on the wrist. And that's really not how the majority of medicine is practiced now. We really do give a lot of autonomy to patients, which is a good thing. But also there is some side effects to that pendulum swinging, where we do put a lot of responsibility on patients that are coming to see us who maybe don't have the language, the education around things like abuse or other issues with their health. And so they should have autonomy. They need to make these choices in their own time, but they also need to be informed and supported. And I think especially in a busy practice, sometimes we get the checklist done, like you said, okay, they left, good, they're safe. No, statistics tell us that's not true. Or, okay, I asked if someone's smoking. I asked if there's domestic violence in the home. I've got my answer, check. Here's what I do. I go down my algorithm, and I've checked all my boxes. I can move on to the next patient because I'm seeing them every 10 to 15 minutes, right?
Yeah.
And people get lost in the shuffle. And yes, we got the data, but what did we do with the data? So I'm so grateful for the work you're doing. And I'm so interested in seeing how it develops and how we in the healthcare sector can be better advocates and better supports for victims and prevent them from becoming victims of murder. Because at that point in time, we can't help that individual. Maybe we can learn from that situation for others, but every single life is precious. And we want to do everything we can to save every life, and also the lives of their children, not only if they're victims of murder as well, but also if they lose a mother or they lose a father in this process, that affects their life forever. And so it's just so important that we address abuse. And so I'm so grateful for the work that you're doing. And I wanted to discuss with you, so we've talked a lot about the perspective from a family member, a friend who's trying to help, a healthcare provider who's trying to help. I'd like to give some acknowledgement to the experience that victims are having. And one of the ways I'd like to highlight that is we were discussing you enjoy, and I myself enjoy, running as a hobby, and many women do. And I think a lot of that is because it's an opportunity to have control over your body. You're doing something for your health. You're strengthening yourself. And for many of us, there's this movement on social media called Run Like a Girl. What does it mean to run like a girl? And I myself, through my channel, have posted these videos because I think they're really powerful to explain why women run, right? We run to strengthen ourselves, but we run to prepare as well. How does it feel to you or resonate with you personally as a runner and someone who has studied and reported on violence against women when you hear these stories that happen again and again to women who are running at night, in broad daylight, alone with a dog, right? They're doing the quote unquote right things. They're strong, they're prepared, and yet they are murdered when they are running.
It always resonates so powerfully with me because we can all imagine the exact scenario that they go through. And I think it says a couple of things to me. One is that mostly men, let's face it, men will not stop at anything if they have decided to be violent. And if they have made that decision about a woman, either a stranger or someone they know, it doesn't matter what they're doing. It doesn't matter because they will find a way. And I think that's really important to remember. So even if a woman is running in broad daylight with their dog, near other people, it doesn't matter to them because they have decided what they want to do with their physical power. And it's sort of irregardless of what she is doing. And I think that says a lot about the mentality of men's violence against women. And I think the other thing that it always impacts on me, and I always probably think, as I'm sure you do and other people do, okay, what are those things that I put in place when I'm out for a run, like regardless of where it is or what time it is, or actually, broadly, I don't run in the dark because I don't feel safe. But regardless of what time it is, I always have my phone with me. I always say hello to passing strangers so they'll recognize me. I'll always know where the nearest house is. My husband always laughs at me with this, but I always take notice of car registrations and the make and model of cars and license plates of cars. And I will always have enough strength in my legs to absolutely leg it if I felt in danger. And I speak those things to my husband and my male friends who run. And I'm like, do you do any of these? And they're like, no. And it reinforces it to you, doesn't it? That all of those things it comes back to what we were talking about in terms of why women listen to true crime. It's that constant risk assessment, that constant threat assessment. Yes, we're doing something we're enjoying by running. We feel strong and powerful, and we are. But there's still that thing of oh, who's that person? Are they following me? Are they not following me? Have they just crossed the road to come close to, it's that constant awareness that bottom line, men who run broadly do not have.
It's a different experience. And of course, I don't want to put women off of running. But I think it's just such a strong example of, like you said, the risks are there and you can do everything right. And at the end of the day, the problem isn't you, the problem isn't women, the problem is violence against women. And that's what we need to deal with. And it makes me think of a personal story for me. When I was in an abusive relationship, I, towards the end, started having this repeated nightmare where I was in a tunnel and I was trying to run and I could see the light at the end of the tunnel and I was trying to escape the tunnel and I would go to run and my legs wouldn't move. They were stuck like I was in cement. And the feeling of helplessness was just overwhelming and you'd wake up sobbing. And I started running. That was one of the first things I did that helped me on my journey of reclaiming my own life and my own agency, was beginning to run. And it was such an interesting experience for me, and it was so empowering. And at the beginning, I'm of the age where you shouldn't do any physical activity every single day. You should switch it up, because if you run every day, your knees are going to start hurting, right? I'm of that season of my life. But when I started, I was doing it every single day, because the feeling of showing myself that I could run, that I wasn't stuck, and getting that data point for myself, and building up that mental fortitude that had been a muscle that had weakened so much over time and over years of being sold a story about myself that wasn't true. That was so life changing. And I think that a part of strengthening ourselves as a community, and especially as women, because as we've said, statistically speaking, the majority of victims are women, is to take those things that we're afraid of and reclaim them, and prove to ourselves our strength in community, our strength in our physical bodies, and take back our autonomy.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's why things like, running and weightlifting and things like that feel so powerful, don't they? Because you are reclaiming your strength, and not just necessarily from abuse, but also from a society that wants to weaken women and have them as, weak and vulnerable and not strong. And I think there's real power there. And it also shows power to, young women and girls who are growing up and can see that and can be inspired by that. And I think that's so, so important, isn't it?
And that's a great point too. When we talk about domestic violence and abuse, little eyes are seeing what we do more than hearing what we say. So we may be trying to send a different message, but they're learning from what we experience in our partnerships. They're learning about how we take care of our physical body. So those things are really important. Now, I think it's you should never bring shame or blame into the scenario, because it won't help you at all. So if you can use it as a motivator to make positive changes for yourself, because often, especially as women, an external motivator can be the thing to jumpstart us,
Yeah.
right? On that cueing, we might not necessarily make that choice for ourselves. So we need to get to the place where we say, no, I'm worth being safe. I'm worth feeling good about myself, about my body, having autonomy. We need to get to that place, but it's important to use our resources to help us get there, and also to be really gentle with ourselves on that journey, because it didn't happen overnight. The abuse didn't happen overnight to get us to the place where we didn't think we deserved those things. And we're not going to rebuild that strength and change that mindset overnight either.
No, absolutely. Absolutely.
Are there patterns that for you in the research that you've done in criminal justice and in femicide that you want to share with listeners from a prevention standpoint, from a safety standpoint, things that they should be aware of as takeaways from what you've learned from the families that you have studied in your true crime podcast and in your research?
I think the main pattern and the main sort of awareness that I really want to highlight is, as we have talked about, knowing some of those signs of coercive and controlling behaviour, and really understanding the dangers that they could pose. And I think one of the things, and we haven't touched on this, but I think it is so important, is, as well as that sort of family and friend awareness, I think people and organisations like employers have a real important role to play here. There's a great organisation in the UK called the Employers Initiative on Domestic Abuse, which is about supporting employers, obviously, to have proactive policies. And there's actually a couple of amendments to some legislation going through Parliament at the moment that's aiming to give domestic abuse leave and like protecting people from being fired if they are victims of domestic abuse and like they have, been off work and things like that. Because I think having that awareness and having that responsibility towards your employees is so vital. And in lots of the cases that I have talked about on the podcast and that I researched as well, victims were going into their work with physical signs of abuse and no one was doing anything. Or, it was that sort of like, oh, we better not ask about that sort of thing. And I think like we need to move away. We need to move away from that mindset and have a real proactive, supportive interest in the people that we employ and that support. And I think that's something else that I would really like to see more of, because there is so much that can be done, but it so often starts with understanding and awareness. And also particularly around, it's really interesting because coercing and controlling perpetrators will often try and disrupt someone's employment to prevent them from having a job. So often they will make them late. They will, make them stay at home, make them take sick days or whatever. Disrupting someone's employment is such a common tactic, because then you get someone that doesn't have to go somewhere else and talk to other people, that probably minimizes their financial independence. So I think it's such a common coercive controlling tactic that employers really should be aware of, and they have a real role there in preventing homicide and abuse as well.
Absolutely. I think that's incredible that the UK has that initiative. And it brings me back to that whole I should mind my business. There's this culture of mind my business, but safety and autonomy and freedom, that is our business, right? And the people around us, they are our business, quite literally. When we're talking about our work environment, that's your business. The people you employ are your business. The people, it's not the products, not the building, it's the people. That is your business. So it is literally your business. And as humans, it is your business to make sure people are healthy and safe. And domestic violence, again, going back to the very top of this hour together, if someone is experiencing coercive control, abuse, violence in the home or otherwise, that's going to limit them in all of the facets of their life. And it can be really easy and tempting to say, oh, they're failing at school, or, oh, they're failing at work, and punish them for that and not get down to the root cause. And there are times when it's quite obvious, like you said, where no, it's obvious that there is a root cause here, but it may feel more comfortable to focus on the downstream effects. But that's not going to get us to influencing change on that issue and helping this person and preventing dramatic and life-changing or life-ending consequences. And this discussion on the work brings to mind something that we know has affected violence and abuse greatly, which is the recent COVID-19 global pandemic. How have you found, with the research you've done, have you examined the effects on femicide and homicide in domestic relationships as it pertains to that time of pandemic when people were even more isolated than potentially they were before during an abusive relationship?
So my research didn't specifically look at COVID years, and I think particularly because I was looking at published domestic homicide reviews. So they often take quite a long time to sort of go through the process and then be published. The family has to be involved. People have to be satisfied with what they're saying. So, and if there's any court processes, then they have to be concluded. So there will be lots of domestic homicide reviews for intimate partner homicides that happened during COVID that haven't yet been published, but ones that I did look at, you can see immediately the impact of lockdown, and we saw it live, didn't we, in the news, and in what, women's organizations were saying. They were seeing a huge uptick in people accessing their helplines, their information, calling for help. Police saw a huge uptick in people calling for help for domestic abuse related issues. And more people were killed, without a doubt, because of lockdown and because of not only the sort of staying together aspects of it, but I'm sure all the pressure around COVID-19 as well. It wasn't something that I specifically looked at in my research. I think as I, move forward in the next few years, I think it'll be really interesting to pick out those homicide reviews that did occur during COVID and see if there was any difference in engagement, because it might be that they were much less likely to have any engagement with statutory services because all of our engagement with statutory services went down. So I think that would be a really interesting topic to explore.
Yeah. And just as a person who is very interested in this, and I am working on a collective book of experts like yourself from around the world in their fields and reporting on both their personal experiences with COVID, as well as what they experienced in their professions and what are the lessons that we can learn. And so I'm really excited about this because I think we as a global community have not really reckoned with the trauma that we all experienced through COVID. We've kind of put it under the rug, but it's getting bigger and bigger and we're tripping on it. And I think it's a seed, like we talked about the seed of coercive control. The trauma we experienced that we haven't addressed and learned from during the COVID-19 pandemic and the side effects of it, maybe not the virus itself, but the side effects to society and the way we live our lives, it's getting bigger and bigger. And we really need to come to a reckoning and unpack it and learn those lessons. So I think that it's so important to do that as a community. It's important that we understand that isolation is not the answer. And often what we see happen with victims is over time, they become isolated, in part because it is expected of them and influenced upon them by the controlling partner. But also sometimes it is choices we make to avoid shame because we're starting to see issues in the relationship and we don't want our friends to see it. We don't want our kids to see it. We don't want our parents to see it. So we further isolate ourselves and then we end up in a situation where we're heavily isolated. But again, the COVID-19 pandemic and that global isolation really showed us the myriad of complications that come from isolation as humans, that it's so unhealthy and it can increase pressures and dangers in the realm of things like violence and domestic abuse.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it would be really interesting to start seeing some of those, particularly in the UK, to start looking at some of those reviews that are coming out from homicides that happened during COVID. And as you were saying, sort of bringing that collective understanding and insight together, because, not necessarily to do with what we're talking about here, but I think we're seeing that long tail of COVID have a huge impact on young people. And there's a huge discussion at the moment in our country about young people who are unemployed and not in education or training. And, it's reaching really high levels. And I think COVID has a lot to say about that, to be honest. But that's not a bad thing.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I think, it's important that we take a look at all of the pieces to the puzzle because that's how we make meaningful changes that help us with prevention. Because at the end of the day, that's what we want. And I so appreciate the work you do to use these heartbreaking stories to share them and to use that information as a way to try to help further the cause of preventing homicides, preventing domestic violence, and working towards a world where coercive control, it's wonderful that it's illegal in some countries in the world, but in others, it's really the norm and societally expected. And I so appreciate your work towards creating a landscape where it's not acceptable. We recognize it as a danger, and we make choices as communities, as people, to act upon it to keep people safe. So thank you so much for the important work that you're doing with that.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the discussion today. It's been so wide ranging. And I think bringing your insight and expertise has been just like, it's been a really fruitful and really interesting discussion. So thank you as well.
Thank you, Claire, so much. Now, I want to mention that you recently announced that you're launching your own women-led boutique strategic communications and influencing consultancy, where you'll be partnering with purpose-driven businesses. Tell me more about that.
Yes, I'm really excited about that. And actually, I'm launching it with my colleague Sean, and we worked at Women's Aid together. So we led campaigns to criminalise coercive control and to invest in domestic abuse refuges and things like that. So we led those campaigns together. So it's so exciting to be creating this business together. And, we're really looking forward to working with companies and charities and social enterprises for that sort of social purpose and really creating change. And I think that is what we're about. And our strapline is where strategy meets storytelling, because as you know, as a podcaster, that storytelling can be so powerful and a real powerful agent for change as well. So yeah, we are really looking forward to that. So please, do check out my LinkedIn to find out more about that news. And I've also got, as we've mentioned, my podcast called Kill It in the Family, which is about men who have killed their whole families. And that's available on all great podcast platforms.
As it should be, because it is truly a great podcast. Everyone listen. We know true crime podcasts are among the most popular podcasts. And it's for a reason. It's very informative and engaging. And I appreciate the work you do, because again, it is storytelling, and it is storytelling with a purpose, and it means so much. Thank you so much for coming on the show today to discuss your work. And I recommend everyone go and follow wherever you enjoy podcasts, learn more, follow Clare Laxton on LinkedIn and on Instagram. Can they follow you?
Instagram, yeah, at Lady Laxton. I'm not officially a lady, but yeah, that's fine.
Follow Claire on Instagram as at Lady Laxton as well, to keep getting this important information for not only your own safety, but also to see how you can be a support for other people in your life. Thank you so much to our storytellers for being here. And thank you so much, Claire, for being on the show. It's been an amazing and informative hour. If you have any questions for us, please leave them in the comments, and please subscribe to the show so that you don't miss our upcoming inspiring guest episodes with people who have reclaimed their story and are living incredible and inspiring lives, and short talks where we work on mastering our mindset from a neuroscience-informed perspective. Until next time, stay safe and take care. I'll talk to you soon.
Everybody's lonely, but you can hold on to me, and I will try to make it right. Everyone